Welcome to the key concepts video for Philosophy of Psychology Week 3. And this week we're looking at Stoicism and Buddhism on the soul. And we're looking at the readings by Alensky called Buddhist Psychology, and the reading by Brad Inwood, Walking and Talking, Reflections on Divisions of the Soul in Stoicism. So you should have completed those readings before you look at the key concepts video, I think is the best way to do it. So you'll already have some sense of what's in those readings when you look at the lecture content that I'm going to give you in this video. So we're looking at two more ancient theories of the soul. This week we're going to look at Stoicism and Buddhism and how they both sort of conceive things in the wake of the theories we looked at last week, the theories by Plato and Aristotle. Stoicism was influenced to some extent by those theories and takes its own kind of tack, different to both of them, in fact. Buddhism is an Eastern philosophy, and it'd be interesting for us to have a look at the ideas that come out of a different tradition and how they thought about the soul and some of the things that kind of that come up as relevant to the investigation in the Buddhist tradition. So we're going to take a look at both of these ideas in this lecture and in the course this week. So starting with Stoicism, we can see there's approximately sort of 500 years between the beginnings of Stoicism with Zeno and its sort of decline after Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor and the last really sort of famous, well-known Stoic writer. So there's a kind of Greek period, the early days with Zeno and Chrysippus. Chrysippus, who was probably the main kind of theorist of Stoicism, and we'll talk a little bit about him in the reading this week. And then from sort of 100 onwards, we find a lot of Roman Stoics and Seneca, and subsequently Marcus Aurelius, two of the most well-known Roman Stoics. A lot of the works of Stoicism didn't survive. We don't have original works by Zeno or Chrysippus, and most of the Greek figures that were around in the early days. Some of the information we have on them comes from later Roman writers who did have access to the texts, which have subsequently been lost. So there's a lot of interpretation and a lot of kind of cross-interpretation in trying to understand the Stoics. So we're going to try and take a close look at the Stoic theory of the soul and try and get a sense of how it kind of differs from the Aristotelian and the Platonist accounts that we looked at last week. All right, so starting with the sort of basic elements of Stoic physics. And the Stoics were believed very firmly in the material nature of the soul, that the soul is a material substance. So that's the only kind of thing that exists for Stoics. So the soul is not a kind of immaterial substance, as it could be argued it is in Plato, and as we'll see next week, that's also the sort of modern approach taken by Descartes. For the Stoics, the soul is of a material nature, and in fact everything is made of these four elements: fire, air, earth, and water, in specific combinations. And most centrally, we get sort of two substances, one that's made by the combination of fire and air, and that's pneuma. This is a sort of a word that means breath. Originally, it's sort of, we have it in words today like pneumatic, which is sort of, blowing up a tire and stuff like that. So reference to sort of, pumping air into something. So pneuma is the kind of is the most important substance. It's like a divine substance for the Stoics, but it's not immaterial. It's actually a combination of fire and air. But it's crucial to the soul and the different sort of divisions in the soul. earth and water, the other two elements, they sort of come together to make up matter, which is the other side of things. So what we find throughout the universe, according to the Stoics, is that pneuma is a kind of soul substance that's bound up with matter in different forms. So this is kind of a broad sort of idea of soul. It's almost like thinking of a world soul, where the soul sort of pervades and sort of goes through everything, sort of matter and all living things, all substances and so on. So for the Stoics, they have this kind of this broad view of the soul. We'll look at the sort of narrow view of the human soul in a minute, but they have this broad view of the soul as a substance in its own right, going by the name of pneuma, that's bound up with matter in various forms. And it's pneuma that gives the kind of consistency to matter, which would otherwise be a kind of formless, sort of just blob of stuff. So pneuma gives consistency and hardness and everything else, all the sort of qualities to matter, when it sort of informs it and gives it structure. So that's sort of the basic idea. And it's the interplay of those two elements, the sort of forming work of pneuma on matter, that sort of creates the different forms of matter and the different types of soul. So with that idea of kind of this sort of soul of the universe, there's this idea of this sort of Stoic great chain of being, right? Where everything in the universe is a combination of pneuma, which is like soul stuff, and matter. So pneuma is it's like the breath of life that's sort of breathed into matter, that sort of makes it, gives it its structure, gives it its consistency. It's like the kind of active principle, whereas matter is a kind of passive principle that receives pneuma and is formed by it. So this is kind of the general meaning, like I said, the broad meaning of the soul in Stoicism, right? There's this idea that the universe itself is made up of this kind of soul stuff, which we saw as a combination of fire and air, this pneuma, and the way it interacts with matter. So the human soul specifically is a specific form of this general world soul. So the human soul has a specific combination of pneuma and matter. So this tells us a lot about the harmony that Stoics saw throughout the universe. And this is crucial to their kind of broader philosophy of life. Everything is made of the same stuff and contains soul or divine elements. Everything in the universe contains those sort of soul elements. It contains pneuma because that's what gives it structure. That's what gives it the sort of principles that make it what it is. And that's sort of the way everything works. So there's a kind of, the whole sort of universe is pervaded by soul. So pneuma adds what the Stoics call tonos, and that's a kind of cohesion or tensional movement through the body or through the matter it is part of. And different types of physical organisms, so again, we saw with Aristotle, we distinguish plants and animals and human beings and sort of matter or physical substances in general. And we'll see similar distinctions in Stoicism, and that's accounted for in terms of different types of pneuma. So it's the different types of physical organism will have different types of tonos, different types of cohesion or tensional movement caused by the way that pneuma is structured in them, caused by the type of pneuma, whether it's kind of rarefied and how rarefied it is, that sort of pervades that sort of physical organ. So for the Stoics, everything in the universe is ordered into four different types of tension, four different types of tonos or tension, characterized by different types of pneuma in its relation to matter. And we can see the four sort of parts here, from hexis, which is the word for the type of coherence or tension in matter, a stone, a piece of wood, so something that's sort of not living or no longer living, but is a sort of piece of what we might call dead matter. For the Stoics, it's pervaded by soul, that gives it a kind of coherence or tension, makes it hard, gives it its properties. And then we have physis, which is the Greek word for nature, in fact. And this is the word for the coherence of things that grow, so typically plants. But the body's nutritive powers are also part of physis, so the way our bodies grow, the way they sort of digest food, and all that is part of the sort of physis, the idea of natural growth. But they're not specifically, so here those things are not specifically part of the human soul as in Aristotle. We saw in Aristotle that nutrition is sort of one of the key features of the human soul. Here they're part of physis, so they're part of the sort of plant soul, and they occur in humans, but they're not specifically part of the human soul for the Stoics. The distinctive functions of animal life are characterized by psyche, a word we encountered last week, which is the kind of meaning for soul. That's the word that means soul in ancient Greek. And the distinctive functions of animal life of psyche are sentience, so awareness, perception, and locomotion or movement. So it's psyche that gives the coherence or tensional movement to animals, that sort of allows them the kind of awareness, the capabilities of perception and movement towards what's perceived that we see as typical of animal behavior. So logos, the final one, is characteristic of the human soul. So that the human soul is rational and possesses logos, and that's sort of what makes it unique among the other forms of soul, that it has this sort of rational structure. So there's a hierarchy of capacities here, similar to Aristotle's scheme. And we might think of these as parts of a soul, of a material part, a nutritive growth part, physis, an animal part, which is psyche, of course, and a rational part, which is logos. And we might sort of think of sort of parts here as these different capacities and how they kind of stack up and build on one another, similar to, again, as we saw in Aristotle's. So we can see that sort of kind of hierarchy here. However, there are other ways of dividing the soul in Stoicism, as we'll see next. An important element here is what Stoics call the hegemonikon, which literally means the leading part of the soul, and the Stoics located that in the heart. And the idea is that it's the hegemonikon that kind of has these sort of connections through pneuma to all these different capacities. And there are 7 capacities here. As you'll have read already in the text by Inwood about the discussion about whether walking is a capacity. So if we don't take walking to be a distinct capacity, if we think that's just an example of sort of rational action and movement, then we've got these 7 parts. We've got taste, vision, hearing, smell, voice, touch, and reproduction. So we've got sort of the senses here, and the sort of capacity of human reproduction, which is considered part of the soul for the Stoics. So everything sort of is filtered through the hegemonikon, right? The hegemonikon sort of has its sort of its trails of pneuma going out to these different senses, and the senses report back to the hegemonikon, and it's the hegemonikon that has the sort of distinct powers to process all of these different kind of senses. So this gives us a sort of picture of the way, another way that Stoics sort of divided the soul. Here it's the division of the human soul into these kind of parts, with the sort of hegemonikon being the kind of ruler here of the soul, and sort of making decisions based on what it receives from the other parts. So there's a number of powers or parts within the hegemonicon. So we can sort of also talk about these as parts, but I think it makes more sense to call them powers. They're capabilities, they're things the hegemonicon does. And we've got four things here: presentation, or fantasia in the Greek, from where we get the word fantasy, of course. And fantasia, presentation, is like perception. We discussed that last week again with Aristotle, the receiving of impressions from outside. So that's one of the things that happens with the hegemonicon. It receives impressions, whether they be sound, vision, touch, etc. And of course, it on the basis of these impressions, that it's going to trigger some kind of action or movement. So impressions sort of lead to the next element, which is impulse. Impulse is the trigger for action and movement, often, as I said, in response to fantasia, in response to what's perceived, what sort of what the person is aware of, and that triggers impulse or action, which in Greek, in ancient Greek, is horme. Assent, which is strongly sort of linked to the capacity to reason, is the capacity to sort of assent, to agree or not to assent to what we are told. So it's about our power to sort of accept or not accept things that we hear. And this is important to the Stoics in terms of one of their guiding principles, that we should only be sort of we should only feel responsible for the things that are within our control, and things that are outside our control are of no concern to us. So assent is one of the ways that we sort of maintain that sort of division, that possibility. So if we're sort of presented with a proposition that something which doesn't concern us, that happened, is terrible and awful, we don't have to assent to that proposition, right? It's something that we just accept that it happened, but we don't assent to the value judgment. So assent is accepting or not accepting what we're told, which of course is very closely linked to the power of reason, the rational power of the soul. And the Stoics saw that idea of reason as kind of linked up with the world's soul. And this is where you see the kind of harmony in their view. It's what we would call a kind of pantheistic philosophy, in that it's like, there's a kind of world soul that pervades everything and is infused with a kind of rationality. And human reason is capable of kind of harmonizing with that world soul, of sort of recognizing it, of seeing it in practice and kind of harmonizing with it. So that's a kind of broader idea within the Stoics of this sort of combination of world soul and individual soul. That's an important sort of part of their view. All right, now let's turn to have a look at Buddhist psychology, or sort of what we can take from certainly early Buddhism about the issues we've been discussing on the nature of the soul. So Buddhism emerges in North India out of ancient Indian religion and philosophy. And there's a tradition at this time, when Buddhism sort of comes about. We see the Buddha is born in Kapilavastu in 480 BCE. So at this time, there's a tradition of wandering ascetics. So wandering sort of, these people they were sort of holy people who would go from city to city, begging for alms, begging for food. And they were called wandering ascetics because they practiced this sort of self-denial. They ate very little food. They didn't they didn't give in to any temptations of the senses. They were very kind of austere. So these were people who rejected the traditional sort of philosophical and religious teachings and were looking for something different, a different philosophy, a different way of living. And the Buddha joined these groups, and eventually finds his own path. Through meditation. In fact, he calls it a middle way. A lot of ideas in Buddhism are characterized as a middle way between sort of extremes. And we'll see that as well in a minute when we talk about Buddhist ideas of the soul. So, as we saw, Buddhism emerges out of traditional Indian philosophy. And that philosophy had a distinctive view of the self. And there's a notion of a world soul here, which interestingly has similarities with the Stoic account. Both are kind of pantheistic beliefs. Both are accounts of a kind of divine or a god that kind of pervades the world and is one with the world, rather than a kind of a separated entity or a ruler, a sort of separate ruler of the world, rather than being conceived as a kind of ruling figure. God here is conceived as being the same as the world itself in its unfolding. And that's the word that the ancient Hindus gave the word Brahman for that idea. So Brahman is the world soul. Atman is the term used to describe the individual soul, which of course is derived from Brahman, the world soul. So for the traditional view, the Atman, the individual soul, is indestructible, and after the death of the body, it either achieves moksha or liberation, or is reborn into another body, is reincarnated. So rebirth is determined by the laws of samsara and karma, which we don't need to worry about here. But certainly the idea that the soul is a kind of indestructible thing, and through religious rites and the sort of correct observance of sacrifice, you can ensure that after death it sort of links up with Brahman and joins with the world soul. So that's the sort of the traditional view that emerges, that occurs when Buddhism comes into being. There were also materialist or scientific accounts of the mind that the Buddha was encountering as well, and it was felt by Buddhism that these failed to account for the experience of continuity of self that was revealed through meditation. So there's something that persists, although it's not quite the self, as we'll see. It's not quite the soul. But there is some persistence over lifetimes, and there's a kind of Buddhist belief in reincarnation, but that's not to be conceived in terms of a sort of substance, the soul that sort of persists across different generations or timelines. So this is the Buddhist middle way, and the key phrase that describes it is the phrase, rebirth occurs but nobody is reborn. Right? So there's no persisting self or no persisting soul, fixed entity that persists over time. Now the text Bielensky uses the term process thinking to describe this experience and this idea. So human experience is made of processes, series of events, rather than things like souls. In fact, the soul is just a projection of that series of events, but doesn't actually exist in a kind of fixed thing-like form. So there's continuity of process, but it's not like there's a persisting thing that continues. So that's the essential feature of the Buddhist view. In fact, Buddhists deny that there is a core self that persists through time when we are alive, even in the course of one lifetime. They say there's no sort of core self that persists. All that makes us up as a person is a series of processes, and these series of kind of interacting, merging processes are going on all the time, and they kind of make up who we are and what we do. And in some way, they kind of continue after our death through their effects, but it's not like there's a sort of substance or a soul that continues. So there's this basic idea of this Buddhist account of process or causation. So they believe that there are not any metaphysically distinct and independently existing things. everything is the result of process, everything is caused by other things, and everything is conditioned by other things. So everything that exists as processes or events that are the results of causal interactions that have given rise to them. And that means that all things are impermanent because they are constantly changing, entering into new causal interactions. So as Alensky says on page 18, we have a tendency to construct stability in a milieu that is profoundly unstable. So our minds go about sort of constructing stability through making these distinct and independent things like soul, and things out there in the world that are fixed and don't change. The mind creates fixed images and ideas from the flow and flux of reality and treats these as real things, as symbols of the real. So we create things and persons out of the flux of phenomena, the sort of flow of events that cause others and give rise to other events and change into other things. And we sort of create these fixed entities, constructing these arbitrary boundaries among things. So for Buddhism, that's false because everything is process and everything is created by other events and other processes and gives rise itself to different processes and events. Now, the Buddhist view of the self is given technically in terms of what we call the 5 skandhas. Skandha just means, it's a word that means bundle. So it's kind of a technical term, but it's not that technical, right? It just means a bundle of stuff. So there are 5 bundles, 5 sort of processes that are kind of bundles of things. And these 5 make up the self, right? So there's no persisting entity behind these processes, behind these things. There's just a list of processes, and that's what makes up the self. So we've got 5 things here. We've got rupa, so there's a sort of corporeal or physical part of us, our cells. And remember, they're constantly changing as well. Our cells are constantly regenerating, they're dying and being replaced. So there's nothing kind of permanent in our kind of physical existence. Everything is changing and sort of developing. The second skandha is this idea of feeling, that we have this. Everything that we encounter with this sort of with this mood of feeling, whether it's pleasant, whether it's painful or indifferent, and that feeling accompanies everything we experience. The third skandha is perception. This is where we pick out the sensible characteristics of an object and grasps that we're seeing something as blue. So perception is where we sort of see things or where we hear things, and we kind of grasp the sensible characters of what we're seeing, hearing, touching, whatever. So there's this sort of sensory character of perception that helps us kind of identify things. Now, volition is the mental forces responsible for our sort of activity. So it's things like, when we're hungry and we sort of move to get food, when we're angry and it causes us to do something, attentiveness and we're sort of led to be aware of something, to watch something. So it's our bodily and mental activity and movement. So we also have this sort of force of volition that causes us to get into bodily and mental activity. And finally, consciousness. And this, of course, is a central one. It's important for sort of Buddhist ideas of meditation, and it's the awareness of our physical and mental states. So these five processes are constantly sort of going on, constantly regenerating, constantly changing. And as we saw, the Buddhists think there's no persisting self behind these processes. So there are 2 arguments that Buddhists give us for why skandhas cannot make up a self. And the first is because they are impermanent. As we saw, the body, the rupa, all the cells are replaced over time. There's no kind of consistency. There's nothing permanent, that can sort of give us a permanent self or a persisting self. Excuse me. And all of the other skandhas originate dependently. In other words, they originate on contact with something received from experience, from the environment. So, for example, the feeling of pleasure might originate from sense contact with ice cream, but when the contact ceases, the pleasure ceases as well. New feelings of pleasure might emerge with renewed sense contact, or we might taste something else to give us a different feeling. So there's no kind of consistency or sort of persistence in the way skandhas work. There's just a kind of contact with something, and when that ceases, there's contact with something else. So there's like a bundle of sensations, there's a bundle of pleasures, there's a bundle of actions, but there's nothing behind those bundles that sort of makes up something permanent. A second argument that Buddhists give for why skandhas can't make up a self is the controller argument. They say that if there was a self, it would be a controller. In other words, it would be able to control what the skandhas do. But each of the skandhas is sometimes other than the way we want it to be, right? They seem to sort of follow their own path. They don't seem to sort of, we often say they work on impulse, but they don't seem to follow a sort of guidance from a controller. So there's nothing within us that seems to perform the executive function. And if that's the case, there's no kind of persisting soul or self that kind of lies behind these changes and these different sort of sensations. And there's an insight from meditation here. What Buddhists notice in meditation is that the mind simply wanders and does its own thing, right? So thoughts are not really in our control. Thoughts kind of take their own path, and we have to sort of remind ourselves periodically to sort of come back to center ourselves. But there's no control over our thoughts. They simply do their own thing. So there's this sense that there's no kind of self behind these processes. So, what does the self or the I actually refer to if there's no kind of persistent self, no fixed self that persists over time? Well, mainstream Buddhism says the self is a convenient designator. Now, we don't have to worry too much about the sort of technical part of this, but what it means is that the self is not actually real, but only real in a conventional sense. In other words, it's sometimes helpful for us to refer to a self and to act as though there's a real kind of self that persists. Right? For example, it's helpful to think that the person that started this class is going to be the same self that finishes it, right? Otherwise, you didn't earn your grades because somebody else started the course and a different person will have finished it. But we think of the self as sort of persisting in these ways because it's conventionally useful for us to do so, right? So our ideas of the self are conventional, but they're not actually real. So there's no sort of real self behind the convention that we can point to and say, yes, that's the real persisting self. But we sort of use that idea conventionally because it's helpful and it's sort of worthwhile to think that people are the same who started an activity, who finished it, who can plan for the future, who make plans and intentions and fulfill those intentions, and who are responsible for the things they say and the things that they do. All those things require this idea of a persisting self. So we see here the three poisons. Greed, hatred, and delusion, and the way they create attachment, aversion in the case of hatred, and delusion in the case of ignorance, delusion producing ignorance. So delusion specifically is ignorance of the transitory, non-permanent nature of things. And that's often what gets us into trouble. That we want to believe that things are real. We want to believe that there are fixed, permanent things, and that triggers our greed. and our attachment to things, and also triggers our sort of hatred and aversion of things. So these things are self-perpetuating. They motivate certain sorts of actions, and those actions in turn tend to reinforce the three poisons. Let's have a look at an example of this. So for example, when greed leads me to take what is not mine, what doesn't belong to me, I am reinforcing the belief that there is an I that can be made better off through what it possesses. This creates a feedback loop that keeps us trapped in the realm of samsara, the realm of reincarnation rather than escape, or nirvana. So with greed, we're kind of reinforcing this belief that there's an I that sort of that possesses things and that can be made more secure and happier by being made to possess more things. So it reinforces that belief that creates this kind of craving for things. And that's what keeps us trapped in the loop of samsara. Mindfulness is, for Buddhism, a big part of the solution to these problems. Being aware of our cravings through meditation, their self-destructive nature, and learning to accept that happiness requires letting these illusions go, letting go the illusion that there's a persisting self, letting go that it sort of matters what we possess and how that reflects on our sort of on our well-being, letting go of the illusions that keep us trapped. Okay, so now that you've completed the key concepts video, you'll have done the readings this week on Buddhism and Stoicism in the week 3 folder. There's a quiz, same as usual this week, quiz 3. The hypothesis markup assignment this week is an article by John Sellers on Stoicism. And the voice thread assignment is an assignment on Buddhism. So make sure you do a voice response to the prompt and also respond to a classmate. As you know by now on the hypothesis assignment, do a comment, do a question and a response to a classmate. Also this week we're starting to think about Essay 1, and the question for Essay 1 is now available on Blackboard. And essays are due at the end of week 6. You can check the course map for specific due dates. But the first essay is going to be on the theories of the soul that we're looking at this week, and we're going to continue next week and the week after as well.